My next duty is to introduce our guest speaker. Now, through the wonders of technology, we are still able to meet and get together and listen to a guest speaker, which is pretty phenomenal. Our guest speaker's name is Peter Ridgeway. Now, I've heard his name 1,000,001 times, and he's a local Blue Mountains resident, and yet I've never actually met Peter. I don't know how we haven't crossed paths, but we haven't. So I'm really looking forward to hearing his talk today. Peter studied at the Uni of New South Wales. He did his honours in a Bachelor of Science down there. He's an ecologist with the local land services, New South Wales Government Department, with a focus on flora and fauna and the restoration of their habitats, particularly in relation to the grassy woodlands of the Cumberland Plain and the Burragorang Valley. And indeed, he's going to be talking to us today about birds of the Burragorang, which is basically our backyard, the Blue Mountains backyard, and an area of great importance to us. I don't think Peter describes himself as a birder as such, but Carol assures me he is extremely knowledgeable nonetheless, and I'm sure his talk's going to be very interesting, and we're looking forward to it. So I'll hand over to you now, Peter.
While we're waiting, I just wanted to pass on a big thank you to Mark and also to Julie, Carol and Therese for supporting today and getting it all happening, particularly with all the IT. It's really good that we can still catch up and talk all things birds despite everything else that's happening. So a really big thank you on that. To give you a quick intro to my talk, I want to share some insights into the Burragorang as an ecosystem, very, very much focusing on the bird life. I'm not myself a birder, certainly not an ornithologist. So what I wanted to cover today is a bit more on the ecology. So hopefully you'll get a deeper understanding of not only the birds of that region, but the why, I guess, behind it. So understanding a little bit about the history, ecology of the region and how that impacts on particular bird species. Also for acknowledgements, I want to give an acknowledgement to Mark Fuller. All the nicer photos in this presentation are Mark. I think I've marked most of them that are his, so a big thank you to him, and he's also helped with some of the field work that I've done in that region. So thank you, Mark, too, for giving a quick intro to country. So I wanted to give a bit of an extended version on that too, just before we get started. Because the Burragorang's a little bit special in this regard. So the Burragorang Valley is Gundungurra country. We're only 3 generations away from the flooding of the valley. We still have quite a number of Aboriginal people who were evicted from the valley when Warragamba Dam flooded the valley. So it is a very, very special place for the Gundungurra community. It's also the only place, certainly for the region, as far as I know, for coastal New South Wales, where Aboriginal culture has been so continual that we've still got song lines and similar features running through the landscape. This is Taylor Clark, one of the younger Gundungurra elders, so-called, and she's at Gungaluk, a waterhole on one of these song lines in the valley. And one of those songlines actually involves the Australian data and actually explains its visitation to some of the waterholes. So this is there's a very strong links between bird life, Gundungurra culture and the valley that are still very much alive. Quick outline for today. So I want to start with giving a bit of a rundown on the ecosystems, and I'm going to do that from a bird's eye point of view, so to speak. So looking at each of the ecosystems of the Burragorang and the surrounding areas, and some of the specific birds that use those habitats, either some notable species or some species that are particularly strongly associated. Then want to quickly go through some of the changes to the valley over time and how those have impacted the bird life and how they explain the bird life that's there and the significance it has today. And briefly, and hopefully not too depressingly, just raise where we're at the moment, both in terms of the raising of Warragamba and also some of the issues around revegetation in the valley. So this is probably sadly, the view that most of you have had of the Burragorang Valley. I'm hoping today I can give you a bit more of an intimate look at the valley. But the geography is fairly straightforward. It's a predominantly north-south running valley, just to the south of us here, really, only a few kilometres south of the central Blue Mountains. So here you can see it, and it basically straddles the gap really between the woodlands of the west, out past the back of Oberon and Lithgow, the woodlands of the Cumberland Plain in the east, and the southern Blue Mountains region. Now, geology is often a good place to start. This is lovely stratigraphy for the Blue Mountains region, the central Blue Mountains. Think of it as layer cake or whatever your particular favourite food is. You simply see slices of the geology, and depending on where you are in the landscape, you can get a fairly straightforward idea of which geology you're on. I'd love to present something like this for the Burragorang region, but unfortunately the Burragorang has the most, let's say, unique, strange, bizarre, confused geology of almost anywhere in the region, and it does not conform to this. There's a lot of local variation in geology in the region. So unfortunately, I'm not going to give you a geology map because it will look like an absolute pig's breakfast, unfortunately, for the Burragorang. But instead, I'm going to go through over time each of those main geological units, and then show the different ecosystems and the birds that are associated with it. So the reason for not having a geology map here is that it's only going to confuse anyone who's not a geologist. Very, very complicated for the Burragorang region. Starting at the northwest of the valley itself is basically sandstone, Kalmung sandstones, very different to the Blue Mountain sandstone, either Narrabeen or Hawkesbury, and often has quite vertical siltstone rocks, like you can see in the picture here. It's a low fertility ecosystem, and it's very cold. So this is up the top end of the Kalmung. The entrance to the bottom end of Canangra National Park and the entrance to Urandery both go through this ecosystem and this geology. And the ecosystem here is wet, open, shrubby woodlands. Even though it's a very infertile ecosystem, it actually geology, it actually supports very open woodland effectively, and a number of woodland birds are found here. It's mostly the cold, the very regular cold, and the low fertility which is keeping it open. It's more shrubby than grassy, but it's the best place I know of to see flame robins for that region. They are an altitudinal migrant, but they don't seem to move far. I'm happy to be corrected on that, but my own observations is they do stay around the areas near, say, Mount Werrong in particular, and often don't even move as far down as the Burragorang itself. So here we've got a low fertility but a woodland ecosystem, and it's a mix of sandstone species and a number of woodland species, but particularly flame robin. So this is the ecosystems we're looking around the sort of northwest areas. You can see Canangra and Mount Werrong shown on this map here. Coming down to the southwest of the valley, one of my more favoured areas, we've got what's called Binduk porphyry. So these are actually volcanic rocks. They're very fertile, very quickly erode. You'll notice I couldn't get a photo of rocks for you. So instead we've had a photo of soil, which is the closest you'll see. Again, quite old, highly fertile. And this supports possibly the most charismatic of the vegetation types of the valley. They're called the Binduk porphyry woodlands. They're dry, open, grassy woodlands. Very similar to what you'll see in the Cumberland Plain and Kapiti valleys in particular. Grey box, white box, forest regum, grassy woodlands, mostly aristida and dry grass like that. For this charismatic species, I wanted to put brown tree creeper, not because it's a particularly rare species, but because it is so abundant in the Burragorang Valley. You can often be physically watching 5 or 6 pairs at a time in the valley. And I don't know anywhere else where you can, in our region, where you can see such numbers. You can see on the little map here how closely they follow the valleys of the Burragorang. The north part of that range is a slightly different ecosystem, which I'll introduce in a minute, but the southern part of that long line of blue dots you can see here of brown tree creepers, that's all Binduk porphyry. Just east of Urandary, as soon as you enter, pretty much as soon as you enter the exclusion area, you're hitting the Binduk and you're hitting those big open grassy woodlands. We've also got riverflat forests, which is just really a wet version of the same ecosystem, right down on the valley floors wherever it's not flooded. Getting a little bit more recent here, we've also got what's called the Lambie conglomerates. I'm not going to go into the geology for you, but again, we've got a low fertility ecosystem. And what's called Cowmung forest. So this is a much denser ecosystem, dry shrubby, very rich in wattles. The one here is the endangered Acacia clunius rossii, but a number of other wattle species as well. It occurs, this is the vegetation you'll see if you visit Urandary, for example. Much of Urandary is covered by this. Again, it's open enough that you do get some woodland species, scarlet robin in particular. And the scarlet robin distribution here fairly closely matches that geology as well. And then down on the Cowmung itself, again, you've got some riverflat forest. Again, getting younger, we've also got granite through the region. The outcrops, while they're quite strongly visible, you can see that real granite colour in this photo here. The patches are so small that they don't really impact the bird life, so I'm going to skip over them today. But I want to talk a bit more about this one, which is called the berry siltstone. So it's like a soft sandstone. This is a stone that occurs right on the edge of the stored water over much of Warragamba. If I actually go back and show you the distribution of brown tree creeper, and you'll see that there's a big long line from north to south following the valley. Those northern records are all on the berry siltstone here. It's moderately fertile, so even though it looks like a sandstone, there's quite a lot of nutrient in there. It supports what's called Tenali forest. This is one to pay attention to, and I'll be talking about it in much more length in terms of its birds. It's a dry, grassy, open forest. It has a lot of sandstone shrubs that come in. You can see some grass trees, xanthoria here. However, it's fairly fertile and it is reasonably open and grassy. And it is, of the two habitats, the best one in the valley for Regent honeyeater. Anything from individuals to medium-sized flocks. Tenali Point in particular is a very regular nesting site for regents, most years with multiple pairs. You can see it in the little clump of records that you can see here just east of Urandary, and running down further south where it also hits the Binduk. So I'm going to talk a lot more about them because I'm sure Regent honeyeater is one of the birds that many members will be interested in. But very quickly, if we get to some of the younger sediments, we've got Shoalhaven siltstones. These form little caves. The inside of these caves is quite fascinating, covered with these fossils, little marine fossils there. And it supports what's called Burragorang slopes woodland. So here we've got grey gums, ironbarks, etc. Fairly shrubby. This is mostly on the east side of the valley. I'm not sure how clear your screens might be, but mostly on the east side of the Wallandilly River. And you can see this is a map of turquoise parrot. And they particularly like this ecosystem. A lot of acacias, but also quite extensive areas of grassland. I think that combination seems to be particularly attractive for the turquoise. A bit of a regional stronghold for them on that east side of the valley. The Illawarra coal, this is where all the coal mines of the Wallandilly are sitting. It's the same, basically the same geology as what they're mining at Lithgow, but again, doesn't have an impact on birds. And then right above this, we've got a cap of Hawkesbury sandstone. So this is the lowest fertility of the ecosystems. It's scattered. It really turns up in small or medium-sized areas rather than any consistent block of this geology in the Burragorang. And you can really get an idea where it is by having a look at this map of Erigma, obviously one of the most sandstone specialists of our species. So west of Durandary, there's a big block of sandstone. Southeast, in the bottom right-hand corner of the map there, you can see another big block of sandstone. And then obviously you've got the sandstones of the Central Blue Mountains and around Canangra as well. So to understand a little bit more about some of these species that I've raised, you need to understand a little bit about the history of the valley. And the obvious change that's happened in the valley has been Warragamba Dam, built between the 40s, I think 48, and raised in 1960. And it's flooded about 75 square kilometres of the bottom of this valley. Now, that's obviously removed a lot of bird habitat. However, it's also caused effectively an abandoned landscape. So many of you have gone down to Durandary and you've seen the so-called ghost town. It's not really a ghost town. There's still quite a decent population at Private Town. But Durandary is actually outside the valley and really has only died because it's become unprofitable. The valley itself is full of abandoned farms. You can see a random homestead here and abandoned farm land. So the Burragorang Valley was cleared pretty much as comprehensively as the Cumberland Plain was and as Lithgow. However, it's now being stripped of all its local residents due to the security concerns around the dam and the water quality concerns. And so we've got effectively an accidental project in natural regeneration of farmland landscapes back into woodland. One of the big differences that you will see if you ever get the chance to visit the valley is there's large areas with no trees and large areas of regenerating woodland. And this comes down mostly to the difference between cropping and grazing. So we had quite considerable areas of grazing, particularly for easy crops like corn in the valley. And most of these have not regrown in any way, shape or form. They are simply large open grasslands, like you can see here, normally of exotic species. So this is cooch, very dry, but trust me, it's cooch, and stinking Roger. And basically it's paddocks of cooch and stinking Roger. These are quite good habitat for the valley. There's very healthy raptors. I think there's about 16 species. Wedge-tailed eagles and the larger eagles are the most common, but you've also got square-tailed kite, kestrels and so on. And they really, really rely on these open areas of cropping. Also really good country for skylarks and other open country woodland birds. If we look into the areas that were grazed rather than cropped, we're looking at regrowth. Here you can see, one old growth tree and the million young trees surrounding it. And this is fairly typical of a lot of our woodland landscapes. But the Burragorang provides a bit more of an insight into these ecosystems. Here you can get an idea on the scale of loss and the size of woodland trees. The regrowth here is really only about 50, 60 years old in most cases. So we're looking at a very young ecosystem, and that's dramatically changed the bird life. This picture here is one that I really, really have found fascinating. This is a spot called Crown Reserve 30. So I've been working in the Burragorang Valley for, I think, about 6-7 years now. And on one trip, I was doing a vegetation transect, just walking randomly through the regrowth, and looked around and suddenly went, all the vegetation seems to have aged. I seem to have crossed this magic line in the landscape. And in a little glade couple of hectares with very large weeping trees like the one you can see here, surrounded by very young regrowth. You can see in the background just how dense those younger trees are, and absolutely chock full of brown tree creepers. I walked around for a bit and thought, oh, I'll just finish off my transect. So I kept on going and got to the other end of what, whatever this old little patch in the landscape was, and then walked around and found that there was pretty much a perfect square of old growth woodland in the middle of kilometre after kilometre of regrowth in the valley. And further investigation showed that this was what was called Crown Reserve 30. So when the valley was settled, the bottom end of the valley was settled latest, quite late in the 1800s, around sort of 1870, 1880. And a timber reserve was established at that time, fenced off for future needs, whether that's timber, firewood, etc. Never cleared. And then 1960, the valley was flooded, farms were taken off, fences removed, etc. And we now have basically a perfect square of old growth woodland in the middle of a regrowth ecosystem. And the impact on that on the birds is something that you really just have to see to believe. Since you can't do that, I've put a few graphs here to explain some of the differences that we're looking at here. So here you can see in blue the Crown Reserve 30, and in red the habitat immediately surrounding it, which is regrowth woodland. So you can see for a start that there's about a third the density of trees in this old growth that there is in regrowth on the left there. On the right there, you can see tree diameter. I'm just checking the chat because someone seems to be all good, all good. So on the right, you can see that the trees are obviously older, much larger diameter. But for birds, I want you to look at the two bars in the middle of this graph here. So the second from the left is the number of logs, or the length of logs in metres per hectare of habitat. In Crown Reserve 30, which is old growth, there's more than a kilometre of length of fallen logs per hectare. So say that again, in each hectare, 100 by 100 metres, there's a kilometre of length of large logs, so sort of over 20 centimetres diameter. It's an unbelievable volume of litter on the ground. And this is really, really changes the bird life in that little patch. Likewise, and this explains the brown tree creepers, you'll see the number of hollows. This is the second from right, the number of hollows per 100 hectares. And you'll see that that's more than doubled compared to the regrowth areas of woodland where there's only scattered old trees. And so we now have this little square in the middle of a vast area of green on the map of old growth woodland with very, very large numbers of brown tree creeper nesting, in many cases more than one in every tree. And a real lesson in the difference between old growth and regrowth in the valley. Now, I mentioned that brown tree creeper is one species that shows a very strong preference for this little patch of old growth. There's other species that really prefer some of the regrowth, and speckled warbler is one which is interesting. In the valley, the places where I've seen the most speckled warbler has been in quite dense regrowth immediately adjoining farmland. So it's a junction between two quite different habitats. Be interested afterwards to hear from others and what their experiences in other regions is with speckled warbler. But in the valley, they seem to have really benefited from that regrowth, but only in the areas where we have both regrowth and very open areas for them to feed. So here's a thank you, Mark. Photo from, this is from Crown Reserve 30 of a nesting pair of brown tree creepers. Still a fairly common species regionally, but certainly declining, and a species that's done very well thanks to the flooding of the valley. I wanted to also explain why this area has changed changed in its significance regionally as a birding area. So this is a map showing you the structural habitats of the Greater Sydney Blue Mountains region. I think this is really quite a useful little map for birding. Where it doesn't really cover the detail of vegetation communities, but rather covers the structural types of vegetation, which a lot of bird species are responding to. So you can see here in the west, in I think it's called puce, anyway, that sort of off yellow colour there, you can see the grassy woodlands between Lithgow and Oberon. You can very clearly see the dry grassy woodlands of the Cumberland Plain. If you just look up north of Penrith in Richmond, you can see the big square of forest that sits in the middle of the Cumberland Plain in the northern half. That's the Richmond Woodlands IBA, rather unfortunately named because it's actually the Richmond Forests. But anyway, that's the Castlereagh Forest there. And if you look down to the sort of lower left, you can see the Burragorang Valley curling down there, and you can see the dry grassy forests, particularly the Tenali ecosystems, that they're in a sort of reddish orangish colour there, curling around near the edge of the water. And then right down the bottom you can see the grassy woodlands, which is mostly the Binduk ecosystems, in yellow down there. The point that I wanted to make is that the Burragorang originally has actually been a very small woodland. In terms of grassy woodlands and grassy forests, it's had a fairly minor role to play regionally compared to the vast grassy woodlands that once covered the Cumberland and the western slopes. However, it does form a fairly continuous link from those western habitats east and almost connecting into the Cumberland Plain. So that those rings of fertile habitats near the water really provide a bit of a regional corridor for birds. The next screen I want to show, this is vegetation clearing. You can see the poor old Cumberland Plain and you can see the poor old western woodlands almost entirely cleared of vegetation, as you can see in red here. You'll also note that in 1990, almost all of the Burragorang Valley was itself cleared. Now, lastly, looking at what's happened, it has been weeds and revegetation. So we've had large amounts of clearing. The Burragorang's been affected largely the same as other habitats have. Regrowth and revegetation occurred almost exclusively on the Cumberland Plain. You can see in orange here is basically regrowth of weeds, mostly vast stands of African olive down on the Razorback near Picton, some around just north of Penrith, etc. And in red, you can see quite substantial areas of planting in the Cumberland Plain. Unfortunately, that planting is all forest density, not woodland density plantings. So really, we've lost a vast amount of vegetation east of the Burragorang. Very few birds moving from the Cumberland Plain into the Burragorang Valley for obvious reasons. But we've replaced a lot of woodland with forest as well. So the end result of all these changes has been that the Burragorang Valley's woodland bird communities in particular have now taken on a very different and much greater regional significance. What was once a fairly small little pocket of woodland habitat where bird populations were probably supported from the Cumberland Plain and indeed from the western woodlands, has now, due mostly to the raising of Warragamba Dam originally, become a real refuge for woodland birds. And while we don't have a banding site in the Burragorang Valley, there's increasing evidence, particularly from regent honeyeaters, that the Burragorang Valley is actually restocking at least the Cumberland Plain and possibly the western woodlands. We have individuals breeding in the Burragorang Valley and then coming into adjoining ecosystems to forage and returning to the Burragorang to breed. I think this change has been a really significant one, and we really need to reevaluate the role of the Burragorang Valley, particularly for grassy box woodland species. On a brighter note, one of the most fascinating changes to the Burragorang Valley bird life in recent years has been the return of wild emu. It's the only wild emu population remaining for our region. We've got what has become now a captive population, possibly down to as few as 7 birds now at the old ADI site near Penrith. But besides that, our only wild population of emu is in the Burragorang. There were no emu remaining in the Burragorang in the 1960s. And this was a deliberate project, an informal, let's say, project, and it was undertaken in the 1980s. Some of you might remember Uncle Pete's Pets, the pet empire. Anyway, the owner of Uncle Pete's Pets, a lovely man by the name of Peter Piggott, made a bit of a commercial empire and wanted to give back, particularly to the environment. And he owns a property at Mount Wilson called Yengo, and used that property in a fascinating program, well worth a discussion on another day, that reintroduced Palmer wallaby to the wild. That was a species that was extinct in Australia, found only on one little island just off New Zealand. And he set up a predator-proof sanctuary and breeding site for Palmer wallaby at Mount Wilson and successfully reintroduced those into the wild. Having done that, he decided to set his sights on emu and bred up a total of 26 emus that were released with one of the waterboard rangers, Ron Mortimer, in the late 1980s. And that population of emus has established, continues to breed, and is playing a very important role in the local ecosystem of the Burragorang as well. You can see 3 immature teenage age emus here. This is taken just on the east side of the Burragorang Valley. You'll notice they're very dirty birds, and this is fairly typical of the Warragamba birds. I'll explain why in a minute. But we've got a population now. We don't have official counts, but the population is probably around the 100 to 150 birds at present. The ecology in the valley is quite remarkable. The primary habitat that they feed in is the regularly flooded flats. So these are the areas that go under water whenever Warragamba dam water levels rise and then quickly dry out again. Then preferred habitat is abandoned farmland, not bushland. They regularly raid. In this photo here, you might be able to see one of the old orchards of pear trees. That's one of the best places to find them. When the pears are in fruit, they absolutely gorge themselves on the number of abandoned orchards in the valley floor. Other areas, I'll come back to this slide, but I wanted to use this. The other area that they'll almost always be found is the really low mud flats that are exposed at low water. One of them called the Island, which is a small island in the central part of the valley. And they browse on the very short, very fertile grasses that grow in the 3 or 4 months that these areas become dry at low water levels. This is the reason that the first thing you'll notice almost always when seeing emus in Burragorang is that they look really, really dirty, because they do tend to fall into quite serious mud holes in some cases, and yeah, they tend to get pretty muddy rolling around on those silt flats. You really can't walk across them yourself. Unfortunately, emu is not a listed species. It's not registered as an endangered species, and this is not registered as an endangered population. So there's real concern about the impact of raising Warragamba, the dam, which I'll go into in a sec, and the impact it will have on emu. Emu in the valley are also filling, I mentioned, an ecological role. There are a number of endangered plant species in the valley, particularly one called Solanum armorense, are obligate dispersed by emus. That is, they require emus to eat the seed, the fruit, and to move that fruit, to process that fruit through the gut. and then basically to pop them out the other side in order to germinate new populations. The species can tick over for small amounts of time without the help of emus. Individual plants just come up and seed where they are, but it's a species that relies on habitat being open, so a tree falling down or other disturbance. And without emu to move their seeds around, the plants simply can't get to those newly emerging habitats. So emu actually have a quite strict and quite critical role in a number of endangered plant species, and probably in many plant species that aren't listed as well. And having finally got emus re-established in the valley, we're now unfortunately looking at the potential of losing emus in the fairly near future, particularly because they are so closely associated with those areas right on the edge of the stored water. So yeah, that leads me into hopefully not too depressing update on the future of some of the bird life for this valley. Hopefully none of you are unaware of the risks associated with Burragorang Dam being raised. Unfortunately, that seems to be getting worse, and the proposals more extreme over time rather than being pulled back. In terms of what the impact will be, raising the dam in a small amount was looking to flood about an extra 4 square kilometres of land, which is a fairly large area in total. It's a very small proportion of the valley. But hopefully by having that explanation I showed you of geology, and also looking at those ecosystems that emu, but also Regent honeyeater prefer, realise many of those key habitats are only a couple of 100 metres wide, and they sit right on the edge of the stored water. So we're looking at losing a very high proportion, or in many cases possibly all habitat for a number of bird species, even with a fairly modest raising of dam levels. And the three of most concern would be Regent honeyeater, which really like those Tenali forests, grassy forests right on the edge of stored water, particularly for breeding. The emu, which feed almost exclusively within 100 or so metres of the water level, and also a number of plant species, Eucalyptus benthamii being one that I've worked on. Yes, this is the impact of dam walls. It's fairly obvious, and it's pretty devastating. One of the fascinating things about the Burragorang is that despite very large areas of very shallow water, you will almost never see any wading species at all. So unfortunately, the stored water doesn't provide any habitats, but merely removes them. Looking at Regent honeyeaters, I already mentioned the loss of much of the Binduk River flats and the Tenali, which is particularly the area that they breed in. Also, unfortunately, lots of cultural impacts. The old growth woodland has many scar trees. You can see one being shown here, and also art sites. The other risk, which I don't currently have an update on, is this contract that's been signed just over a year ago now between the National Parks and Wildlife Service and CO2 Australia for carbon offset planting. Some of you might have seen Deb Stevenson's objections to this in the paper. Basically, this is a program which is looking at the grassy glades, open forests, and planting trees, effectively infilling those woodlands to forests. Unfortunately, this is not just a risk to the Kapiti, it's also been proposed in the Burragorang. It's been something that's been objected to at the staff and expert level at national parks, has cost the careers of more than one person in that agency. But unfortunately, as far as I know, we still plan to go ahead. And this is a real risk for those species that rely on open grassy woodlands. In particular, a couple of species, one which I haven't spoken of but happy to answer questions about, which is diamond firetail. They're really only found in the southern Burragorang, right down in the grassiest forms of grassy box woodland where there's good native grass cover. Brown tree creeper, a species that really does rely on the open areas and woodland spacings of trees, and regent honeyeater as well. So that's one to keep an eye on for those concerned with regional bird life. We definitely don't want to see the Burragorang Valley woodlands effectively converted to forest. So I've hopefully done that fairly quick because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I've left my contact details there too. I'm always happy to take questions afterwards. So hopefully this has gone smoothly and everyone's been able to hear me. I'm going to unshare my screen now and happy to take some questions.
Hey Peter, thanks for that presentation. I've always found that whole area just absolutely fascinating. You know, my father helped build the dam, so you know, I can't take it back to him as an issue because he's gone too. But that whole southern area there, it's Urandery. It seems like that's the only point of access into that area. It's really frustrating, isn't it, for the public not to be able to get in there, like as a club for us to go into that area.
Yes, I've certainly taken a few birders down when I've had the ability to do so. It is worth noting, and I can provide some information if there's interest, and I can guess it can get forwarded around, but it's worth noting that there's the bushwalkers corridor that runs right through the middle of the closed catchment. Now, most of you are not going to feel like doing a 1 to 2 week multi-day pack walk, and so people don't tend to think of it, but you can actually walk east from Urandery along that corridor, and as a day walk from Urandery you can get to some quite nice both riparian river flats, including one of the regent honeyeater breeding sites in the Casuarinas, right on the Wallandilly River there, and also to some quite decent grassy box woodland, particularly for speckled warbler, some good country there, as a day walk through that bushwalking corridor going east from Urandery. I don't know a lot of people who've done that, but it's well worth it because Urandery itself is not on the more fertile geologies. You need to go further east into the main valley to pick up a lot of those woodland species. But you can do it as a day walk from Urandery as long as you stick to that bushwalkers corridor.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Peter, I've spent a bit of my misspent youth along Scots Main Range and to New Yards there. And the pictures that you had of the woodlands brought back memories, certainly. And I think I vaguely remember that we may have seen restless flycatchers in that area. Do you have any evidence of that?
Yeah, there's been restless flycatchers. I don't know on Scots Main Range, but restless flycatchers down near Jurylands in the past, which is sort of southeast of Urandery. Yeah, I don't think they're that hard to find down there, although I haven't gone specifically looking for them. But yes, Scots Main is really sort of the further you go on Scots Main, the more you get towards almost in some parts Hawkesbury sandstone. So you tend to just get more of the woodland, more of the typical Blue Mountains, sandstone forest species. But the very tip of Scots Main Range, you come back down and you come into the Cowmung there, and that's always a good spot to look out for quite a few different things just before you hit the river flat on the north end of Scots Main Range.
It was on the top there was where I first saw my first lyrebird.
Carol, sorry.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions on the chat. Now, Debbie asks, is there a possibility of a trip for the club to the valley. Now, I think I can partially answer that. It is actually a restricted area, and it's quite hard to get a permit to go in because it's Sydney's water supply. But maybe, Peter, you might have further information about that.
I can try, is the honest answer. Yes.
And not only that, it's quite a long, it would be quite a long trip to get there, because even though in a straight line it's close, the access is not that easy. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in there, if you want to continue.
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. Yeah, it would be a long day, and we need a limited number of people because a lot of four-wheel driving to get down. But it's possible. I'm happy to take that one on notice, ask a few questions and see what response we get. It can also just depend on the politics around the dam too. So mid part of last year, it was quite hard even for me just getting my regular access for work down there. But at other times they've been much more relaxed. So we'll take that one on notice and see what we can do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Now, a question from Liz. Is the dam a fait accompli yet, or is there hope to have it not go ahead, the dam raising?
Yeah, so we wait to see. There's a real chance that certainly at the moment they're not particularly keen on the dam because no one is really going to be congratulating the government on spending hundreds of millions of dollars of cash in the middle of a recession on a project that will do very little for employment. So COVID may have at least put the hold on this for purely financial reasons. We may also end up having the fight of exactly how high the dam wall is. And you saw some of the slides where I showed some of the geology right on the edge of the dam, and you could see it's only, some of these key habitats are only 100 metres wide. So exactly how high they raise the dam actually is going to make a huge difference to the birds. So even 1 metre less than otherwise would actually make quite a difference to the bird life of the valley. I know they're not large hectares, but many of these ecosystems are narrow bands to start with, so that any battle over exactly how high the dam is will be a really significant one for species, particularly those species that are right on the fertile flats. Diamond firetail in the south part of the valley, for example. Basically, if those grasslands are flooded, which is only a matter of centimetres rather than metres, well then, there's really no viable future for diamond firetail in the Southern Valley. So it's worth it, and we wait to see what the fight actually will be when they come public on this.
Yeah, I agree. This is one of the most important, of all our local conservation issues for birds. I think this is one of our most important. It's just unfortunate that because it's in an area that most people don't get to, people are not aware, or it's not in the forefront of their mind how valuable it is. It's incredibly valuable. There's a question from Les about the impact of the recent fires. Do you know much about how that?
Yes. So interestingly, the Burragorang Valley itself, so that Binduk, porphyry, big open grassy woodlands, almost none of that burnt. It's a very small ecosystem, so you don't see a lot of green on the burn maps, but in fact 90+% of that habitat is intact, including Crown Reserve 30, which is one of the key breeding sites for the hollow-dependent woodland birds. So there's actually quite a bit of good news there, and that really has to do not with anything that got done, but the fact that there's been so much farming in that grassy box country that there were big breaks, and the fire just didn't get in to a lot of that woodland. The Tanali forests, which are the other habitat though, which is really key for regents, including a number of those regent breeding sites, burnt, and it burnt incredibly hot. So it burnt out existing trees, like mature trees just burnt to cinders. So that impact has been really, really big. So probably the species that's been most impacted by the burns is the regents, because they were on that, and obviously the sandstone species. So the sandstone species have been hit. Very, very extensive areas of the Hawkesbury sandstone burnt in the Burragorang Valley, and also quite large areas around the Cowmung, and also some of those alpine, high elevation habitats too. But the Regents is the biggest impact. I'm really interested to see and encourage people to be looking both at Lithgow and in the Cumberland Plains, such as Mulgoa, where Regents do breed, whether we see more Regents coming in this season in the next couple of months. We don't know how many of those Regents survive the burn as individuals. So there's very little breeding habitat left in Burragorang for them at the moment because of the burns. So the question is, are we going to see increased activity and hopefully breeding around Mulgoa, Warumbi, etc. in the Cumberland Plain, and maybe as far as Capertee, depending on whether birds have moved into those areas, or have the birds actually been killed by the fires? We don't know. But that's a real concern, because pretty much all of the Tenali breeding site burnt, is my understanding.
Thanks. That's interesting. Now there's a question from Senthil Pavai. I hope I've said that right. Thank you for an awesome and informative talk, Peter. What native species did Peter mention as being spread by the emus?
Okay, so I mentioned one endangered species, and that's a flora species I've worked on, and I'm sorry, it doesn't have any other name. I can write it down and get an email, but it's Solanum armorense. So it's solanums are, I'm trying to think of common names for other species, but some of them are called bush tomatoes. They're mostly spiky leaved plants that have small tomatoes, little fruits that look like the little mini tomatoes. And we've got one species, it's a very, very rare species. It's listed endangered. It meets the criteria. It should really be critically endangered, which grows around the Burragorang Valley and also up around Mount Arnold, which is just north-west of Urandary, but mostly in the Burragorang Valley itself. And those small tomato-like fruits, which we've had cameras on the plants to find out what germinates and spreads the fruit, and also trialled looking at emu patties and what germinates out of them, and Solanum armorense is definitely spread and does quite well after being digested by emus. So that's the species that I obviously have the most direct evidence. Or they're also spreading pear around, and European pear around the bottom of the valley. I don't know if that counts. And a number of the other fruit, like European fruit species, are being spread. I would put good money on the fact that they're probably spreading a number of other plants that are around the edge of that woodland that have either acacia-like seed heads, so probably Acacia clinis rossii included, and other species. But anything that's got a fruit or a nice long wattle nut, the emus tend to eat. So I would suspect that if we looked closely at those species, many of them are probably benefiting from the emus. But the solanums are the one that really, really does seem to rely on them heavily.
Yeah, thanks. There we have a comment from Helen. You can follow the campaign to stop raising of dam wall via the Colong Foundation website. So yeah, that's a good one to remember. Yeah, thanks for that, Helen. Now I have a comment or a question, and that is when I was, I think it was about a year ago last summer. So it was the summer of 2018-19 that I was in there, I think. Anyway, it was doing Regent honeyeater surveys, but we found we found painted honeyeaters nesting along the river there in that southern section, and because there's so much mistletoe growing in the river oaks, and that I think it's about the closest place to Sydney where, you know, I mean, it's a threatened species and quite a hard bird to see, and to have them breeding there so close to Sydney was pretty special. So yeah, that's another really important bird, I think.
Yeah, I can only agree. Look, besides that nesting there, I don't know much more about painted honeyeaters in the valley. They don't seem to be common in the valley, but they're definitely around. But the fact that they exist at all, as you say, like, I think that's the most easterly that they breed. I have a suspicion that they might be some of the birds that occasionally turn up at Penrith on the river there might have actually come from Burragorang.
Yeah, look, that's interesting because I've been hearing about them breeding at Penrith, but before this year, I actually wasn't aware of any nesting in the Penrith area. I don't know if you were or anyone, but that seems to be quite a recent thing.
So I will leave it to people who know them better. I don't know of them breeding around Penrith. I know they've turned up at quite a few times. Probably worth asking around whether they've been confirmed to breed and whether it was successful or not.
Yeah. I mean, they're regular in the Capity Valley, but they're one of those really elusive birds and pretty special. And there are records of them breeding in the Western Blue Mountains along the Cox's River, but not every year. But yeah, it was pretty special to find them there in the Burragorang. They're a mistletoe specialist, so they they go wherever there's lots of mistletoe fruiting. So, okay, now, right, a question. Okay, Liz Field has said she must go, but thanks, Peter, a great talk. So thanks for that, Liz. Has she left already? I think so. Now, Lynn writes, Peter, what's the organisation that you're working for that takes you into the Burragorang?
Yeah, sure. So I've done this presentation as a community member so that I can talk a little bit more openly about stuff. But my work, which is what gives me permits to go in, is Greater Sydney Local Land Services, which is a state/federal agency. And so I work as a biodiversity specialist there. So I've particularly actually a lot of the bird observations I've had in the valley have actually been doing flora work in the Burragorang on some of the threatened flora down there, but also been involved in some of the regional weed campaigns down there too. There's African olive in the valley, which is a real concern. Anyone who's gone to Razorback or Picton will know what that weed will do to grassy woodlands. But yeah, so we've been working to try and eradicate that. So, but today I thought I'd just talk as myself rather than representing the agency, just so that so that I can talk a little bit more freely about some of the, particularly in terms of the threats to the valley and that side of things.
Can I ask, without notice to Carol, what are the other threats, Peter? Apart from fire, obviously, and the dam raising, but what do you see as other threats in there?
Well, I'm really concerned about the CO2 Australia program, because they were talking about, I remember discussions with national parks where they were talking about planting basically one tree every square metre in the valley, in grassy box woodland, unbelievable, and very few woodland specialist birds were going to survive those sort of densities. So I think that's something that I really wanted to get onto people's radar, and because it's the Burragorang, people don't, the public doesn't really hear about these threats or necessarily even know the region. But I think that that's one that really want to keep on the radar. We've obviously got continuing threats from feral animals. The feral horses are, if anything, increasing in number rather than decreasing. And the feral pigs are a major problem. the feral pig population, which is vast out there, is a particular problem for ground nesting birds. So speckled warbler in particular. We don't have direct data on that for the Burragorang, but I would suspect that given the very heavy load of feral pig activity in the region, that they're taking out a fair few nests of speckled warblers and other ground nesting birds. I mean, it's not uncommon even in the daytime to see 30, 40 pig in a herd. So there's a lot of pig in that valley and around Uranda in other areas too. And they are a predator, like foxes. They're an omnivore, so they take animals, and particularly ground nesting birds, chicks, eggs, whatever. So I think that's another somewhat unrecognised problem in the valley. The national parks and actually my work LLS have both got campaigns trying to control feral pigs, but yeah, that's an ongoing battle. We also have had regular incursions of ferrets in the upper areas, particularly the sort of around Mount Werrong. I've spent a lot of time knee-deep in snow trying to catch ferrets. They do seem to have potentially bred, but then died out, as far as we can tell. But people keep coming in. Presumably they're coming in with people ferreting for rabbits. And I'd be quite concerned, particularly about things like button quail, which are still relatively common in sections up there, which are not going to do very well with a predator like ferrets. If they do establish long-term, or possibly have established long-term, that is a new threat really for New South Wales. Ferrets are not an animal that we want established in the wild. It looks like that one has been, well, not nipped in the bud so much as just died out by itself, but it's very concerning. Yeah, having ferrets in the wild in a big area like that, and lasting for considerable amounts of time, yeah, it scares me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Helen would like to know if you can put your email contact address again. The other thing is I have that as well. So would
I'm happy for you to just forward it to people or put it in the newsletter or something.
Yeah, I can. I took a screenshot of that, and I think I've got it anyway. So I can, if anybody would like that, just let me know, and I'll send it to you. So I'll make a note to send that to Helen. Yep. Okay. Do we have any other questions? It's been a great lot of questions. Are there any more? Yes, Helen.
Maybe it's in the form of a statement. I don't know whether Peter wants to comment on this, but in respect of probably lots of aspects of this, but certainly control of feral pigs and other feral animals. I mean, I understand there's been substantial funding cuts, not just to the National Parks and Wildlife Service, but to your organisation in its various locations as well. And so the capacity and the systems to control these threats is, very substantially less than it would have been, 10 years ago or so. And that I guess I'll say if people feel inclined to write letters to the Premier or Matt Keane or anybody else, it's so things have gotten a lot worse in the last few years.
Yeah.
I see you're nodding your head, so I'm
yeah,
right.
I don't think I need to add anything to that, Helen. I think that stands on its own merits.
So any more questions? Last call for more questions. Raise your hand. No?